this slew of different mechanisms that are coming up, those different classes of drugs, I think for me, that is the excitement, the prediction, the path forward. We're not just talking about the second or the third or the fourth drug in the same family. We're talking about unimaginable, exciting new families of drugs. So I think that is where the immunotherapy, the combinations of these drugs in relapsed refractory patients, the opportunity of using these drugs even early on and getting those patients time and again that deep response. And I think a bigger focus on the survivorship with myeloma, because as we treat the disease better, we're being able to hopefully give the better quality of life to that patient and bring them closer to their goals within their life.
Hello and welcome to Cure Talks. This is Priya Menon, your host. Today's show is part of our innovative series where we discuss breakthrough treatments and research. The topic for today's discussion is the evolving treatment paradigm of multiple myeloma. And on the panel are Dr. Sikandar Ailavati, oncologist from Mayo Clinic, and Quinn Young, Chief Mission Officer of the MMRF, Brian McMahon, founder, CEO of Spark Cures, and patient expert Jennifer Alstrom, founder, Health Tree Foundation. Welcome to Cure Talks, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. In the past decade, the FDA has approved 13 new agents and 29 treatments for multiple myeloma, which have transformed the treatment paradigm for patients. We have BCMAs, antibody drug conjugates, CAR T cell therapies, bispecific therapies, and I think we have a lot of ground to cover today. So the goal is just to get some different perspectives. I'll start with you, Dr. Ailavati. It has been an exciting few years for myeloma, as we all know, with CAR T also added to the myeloma treatment options. What do you predict will be the change in treatment scenario with this addition?
Priya, thanks a lot for hosting this, and thanks for the question. And I'm glad to see Jenny and Brian and Anne on the call. So glad to connect with everybody again. So I think you point out exactly correctly that this is a very exciting time. It's exciting for a physician, a clinician like me who's focused on myeloma treatment because I have more options to discuss with my patients and I have more options to sequence therapy or try to plan something. It's also exciting for the researcher in me to be able to participate in these clinical trials, and when suddenly even a phase 1 gives an MRD negative response to a patient who's had an auto transplant, an allo transplant, etc., you cannot imagine how happy not only the patient is, the physician is, but even the research staff who's dealing with that patient. That literally we can see that spark in everybody's eyes. And then above everything else, I think I hesitate to use the term exciting because unfortunately for a patient who's living with a diagnosis, I don't think that term applies, but it's an optimistic time for that patient because they suddenly have more options they can go to. So I think if your question was, how do you see, or what is the prediction, or where is the field going, etc.
Yeah.
I personally feel that if we were to use a term of immunotherapy for multiple myeloma, I believe that era started potentially 1.5 years, 2 years ago, and that area has exploded. That area has suddenly, this whole concept of T-cell engagers, CAR T, other kinds of immune mechanisms, modulating the tumor microenvironment, this slew of different mechanisms that are coming up, those different classes of drugs, I think for me, that is the excitement, the prediction, the path forward. We're not just talking about the second or the third or the fourth drug in the same family. We're talking about unimaginable, exciting new families of drugs. So I think that is where the immunotherapy, the combinations of these drugs in relapsed refractory patients, the opportunity of using these drugs even early on and getting those patients time and again that deep response. And I think a bigger focus on the survivorship with myeloma, because as we treat the disease better, we're being able to hopefully give the better quality of life to that patient and bring them closer to their goals within their life.
I would still say research point of view, I think a lot of exciting things happening. Very optimistic. Dr. Alaldi, I'll be back with you. I'd like to hear from the rest before we actually start discussing, what else is going on with myeloma. So, and I see that you're the mission officer of the MMRF. Could you just give us a little background as to what a mission officer does at the MMRF? And then, as we said, we'll get into the real discussion.
Sure. It's to be chief mission officer of the MMRF it's an extraordinary honor. Mm-hmm. I've been with the organization coming up on 20 years. And so all of the progress that Dr. Alaldi alluded to recently, I can look back, and when I started, how patients were treated was so incredibly different today. Prognosis was so different. It's true, it's never exciting to get a myeloma diagnosis, but the unprecedented response rates and depth of response, it's incredible. And we too are very optimistic for patients moving forward. So as chief mission officer, it's really my responsibility to make sure that every single thing that we do at the MMRF is in line with our mission. And that's to accelerate a cure for each and every patient with multiple myeloma. And they're the obvious, are we investing in the right research? Are we doing the right trials? Are we investing in developing data sets and interrogating those data sets and make them available to drive precision medicine and cures for every patient? But it can come down to everyday decisions where we always need to make sure that we have our mission in mind and we're putting the patient at the center.
And can you also talk a little bit more about MMRF's strategic priorities? I know we have talking about patient-centric solutions.
So as I mentioned, from the very beginning, when our founder, Kathy Giusti, who's a multiple myeloma patient, and her sister started the organization, our mission has never changed. How we go about achieving that mission has evolved tremendously as we as an organization have grown and evolved, and as a treatment landscape has evolved and changed quite honestly very, very, very dramatically. How we look at our work right now is really in three different pillars. One is accelerating new treatments for patients, and that's because the disease is still largely incurable. Mm-hmm. We want to make sure that there's as many new treatment options out there, so when a patient does relapse from a treatment, that the next treatment is there. The second focus is really on driving more personalized approaches, precision medicine. So we generate data, we share that data, we analyze that data so that we understand how to use all of these treatments that are currently available as well as those that are emerging. With all of the options that you mentioned, Priya, in the beginning that are available, there are so many different combinations, so many different ways to sequence these therapies. And then when you couple that with the different patient types, whether it's based on genomics or immune profiles or anything else, there's so many different options, and you really need a lot of data to make sense of that. And then the third piece is with all of these advances, all of these new treatments, all these new trials, we want to make sure that patients and the entire community are aware of them, that they're educated and can optimize their own outcomes. This means knowing what research opportunities are available so that, again, any patient has that opportunity to participate, but then also understanding all of the new treatments that are available, ones that might be right for them, and not just limiting it to patients who may be treated at large academic centers with myeloma specialists, but even patients in the community, them and their doctors and their caregivers, again, understanding what options are available to them to best optimize their outcome.
Thank you, Anne. I'll be back for some more details of what MMRF is doing. Moving on to Jenny. Jenny, hi. I know you are a patient advocate, and I should say a patient expert and founder of Health Tree and Myeloma Crowd. How have you seen, over the period of your care, how have you seen the care evolving for people living with myeloma?
Well, I think, as been said before, a lot of different new options, whole classes of drugs that weren't available before. I was diagnosed in 2010, and I chose tandem transplant just because there was nothing. If you said the word cure, in that time period, you were kind of mocked, or you just no expert was talking about that word, and you hear them talking about that word now. So having, I selected a clinical trial just recently and went through a CAR T trial. Yeah. And I did that very intentionally because I wanted to take advantage of some of these newer technologies that are, like Dr. Alawadi said, are making such significant advancements. And as a patient, I saw a lot of gaps wanted filled during the course of my care, which is why I created the Health Tree Foundation, so we can look at these new therapies and the data of those new therapies and say, what is the best at frontline therapy for a particular kind of patient in the real world? What's truly happening? So I see a lot of things evolve, not just the treatments, which are very exciting, and but we're able to apply technology also to some of these problems that really haven't been done in advocacy before, and help accelerate that cure.
Thank you, Jenny. Moving on to Brian. Brian, you've been a myeloma caregiver and caregiver to many other cancers also. And I believe the gap in information and access to clinical trials had you come up with Spark Cures. Can you talk a little bit more about how folks can find trials, what Spark Cures does, and I'd like to know how far you track your trials. Do you track people getting recruited as well? Be great to hear about that.
Yeah. So this really all started with my mom back in 2005. And I know I've shared the story, publicly before, but as a brief intro to this, my mom was diagnosed in 2005, which is a lifetime ago in the scheme of multiple myeloma. I mean, to put this into perspective, we're talking about CAR Ts and bispecifics and monoclonal antibodies. None of those things existed in 2005. Maybe, daratumumab in some early clinical trials, early. My mom was diagnosed before Revlimid was even approved as an FDA, therapy for myeloma, to put that into perspective. And the difference is that when my mom was diagnosed, they gave her a really poor prognosis, right? They didn't expect her to live the month even with treatment. She was sent home on a Velcade prednisone therapy, right? That was her first line. And the difference is my mom was a 30+ year oncology nurse who at the time was working for Amgen, right? So not only did she have the clinical expertise, but she had the Rolodex that comes with working in a large pharma company. Within 2 weeks, she had found a clinical trial that was 1,000 miles away from our home. So this wasn't something nearby at the University of Arkansas. And much like Jenny, she underwent a tandem transplant. She was part of the Total Therapy 3 protocol at Arkansas. And the difference there is, my mom ended up living with her disease for about 2 years. And I like to say it wasn't the outcome that we wanted, but when you're given a month and you get 2 years, you really understand and see the importance of what clinical research is bringing. And you see that the only reason these new drugs that we have, CAR Ts and bispecifics, coming to clinic, is because of patients who are participating in research and helping to push that forward, and researchers and pharma companies and advocacy groups, right? This is a community effort to advance this so we can find that cure. And I think the point of starting Spark Cures was that, in a 10-year period, I was a cancer caregiver 4 different times. My mom was the only one to go into a clinical trial, right? And the stories that I can share anecdotally about, the trials and tribulations of going through that. But, we started Spark Cures with the thought that, in the premise that you shouldn't have to be a 30+ year oncology nurse or working in a large pharmaceutical company in order to navigate your clinical trial options. And that's what we've been doing for the past 7.5 years.
Thanks. We know too well how difficult it is to get the right trial. be found eligible for that and then get enrolled. So thanks, Brian. Dr. Elavdi, circling back to you, I know you talked about immunotherapies having exploded and having so many different types of drugs now. Could you also talk about the scope of radiotherapeutics, which I think you're involved, we are working on, and we'll also like to hear about the CLR 131 that with some of the latest results would be great.
Sure. Priya, thanks for that question. So as we talk about these different or unique classes of drugs, radiotherapeutics are not something that are new to the area of cancer. In heme malignancies, there have been prior radioisotopes that have been used. And there are radioisotopes that are used, for example, in prostate cancer, some of the solid tumor malignancies. Mm-hmm. So in similar light, radiotherapeutics are a unique class, at least for myeloma, because we have not had radiotherapeutics previously. Now, what is a radiotherapeutic, just for those who are our listeners, is basically a drug with a tiny amount of radiation attached to it. And this radiation would be given as an medication, as an IV medication, for example. And then that would go around, seek the target that it is against. So whatever is that quote unquote drug, that will seek the target and then deliver that radiation at that target and try to kill that cell. We know that radiation is very active in myeloma. We use radiation time and again for different reasons. So if there was a drug that could seek plasma cells and be able to deliver radiation there, that would be a desirable treatment option. That's the whole premise. So at Mayo Clinic over here in Jacksonville, Florida, where I work and lead our myeloma group, we've been involved with one such radiopharmaceutical or radiotherapeutic for myeloma for quite some time. It is called CLR I-131. And over the few years that we've been involved with this drug has made its way through a lot of different iterations in which it used to be given as one dose, then fractionated dose. And now the way this trial is set up is that it's giving patients 2 kind of fractionated or split dose initially, and several weeks later, the patients get another 2 doses. But it's basically the total amount of radiation being given in split parts so that it's less toxic, but hopefully more beneficial. You can almost imagine that as our bispecific antibodies for myeloma came about, they were initially just 1 regular dose, but now most of the bispecifics give a step-up dose to be able to give it more safely. Similarly, the radiotherapeutics being given in split fractionated dose to be able to get more benefit. Our experience has been, we at Mayo Florida have probably treated more patients with this drug than anybody else because we've been involved since the beginning, different dose levels, different diagnoses, whether it's myeloma, Waldenstrom's, or certain kinds of lymphomas. So what my experience has been that the way the study is set up is a little unique because it gives the patient treatment, follows them through a certain period of time when the patient has gotten over all the safety concerns from the drug, if any. And then at that point, we have assessed what's the response rate. And so far, majority of the patients, I can tell you, who have gone on this drug, through that follow-up period of several months, have had stable disease or better. Some even have responded, but stable disease or better. And we have frequently used this. In fact, I just had a discussion with a patient earlier today about this. We have frequently used this as a bridge when the patient is looking for a treatment option where they could come to a center, get the clinical trial treatment, and then go back to their home and keep getting a lot of the standard of care care close to home and hopefully have disease stabilized. The things that I keep in mind when I talk to my patients about this is that here is an option where they get just that radiopharmaceutical as an IV treatment in 4 different time points spread over several weeks. But and in between, the patient is actually able to go back to their local physician, keep getting monitored with labs. By the way, there is no treatment in between. It is just those 4 isolated doses of the radiopharmaceutical There is no dexamethasone, no anything in between, and the patients frequently just follow up with their local doctors. That's how conveniently the clinical trial is written. Because as Brian was mentioning, Brian, you were mentioning about your mother, that she was able to identify a trial, but that was 1,000 miles away. How many patients have the resources? And maybe they can come once or twice, but if we start saying, hey, you're going to come every week, that's not going to be possible. How is that patient going to live away from their home without their caregiver support group? How are they going to do that? So those are the other positives about this trial. What we've seen is that we are at a point now that the dose is defined, and it's not like a dose escalation, whether it will work or not. Dose is defined. We expect that after the patients get the first 2 doses, almost like clockwork, 2 weeks later, the counts go down. Those counts stay down for about 3 weeks or so, where the patients may require some growth factor or transfusion support, and then the counts come up. In majority of the patients, the disease goes down and stays down for a certain period of time. That has given me an opportunity to find them that slot on CAR T, or find them that slot on the bispecifics, etc., other treatments. So for us, it's worked out as an excellent bridge to the next thing.
So Dr. Ailawadhi, who is the target patient population here? Who would be eligible for receiving this?
So the way the clinical trial is written, it is broadly, patients are broadly eligible. And in fact, I should point out, I don't want patients to get a false hope around it, but this sponsor has actually allowed some of the non-secretory patients to also get onto the trial. That is a subset of patients who do not have any measurable disease in their blood or urine. And unfortunately, the only way of testing is either repeated imaging with PET scans, etc., or bone marrow biopsies. But every now and then, we have been able to get approval to even get non-secretory patients, because we have seen that they also benefit. So that is just a unique thing. I can't say that every non-secretory patient can go on, but every time we have a patient, we make a request, we evaluate, and if the company feels that they have the bandwidth to accommodate a non-secretory patient in the trial, they have done that. So in my mind, I've used this for patients who have gone through some of the initial lines of legitimate therapies, the proteasome inhibitors, the immunomodulators, the monoclonal antibodies, maybe even CAR T. We have now had patients who have had prior CAR T have disease progression, because frankly, BCMA targeting therapies, CAR Ts, are bispecific. They are able to give long-term responses to a subset of patients, but a lot of other patients still progress after that. So we need options. So we've used this for a broad slew of different variety of patients in the relapse refractory setting, who've typically gone through the first 3-4 lines of therapy and have gone through most of the legitimate treatment options that are available.
Thank you, Dr. Ailawadhi.
Priya, can I jump in on that real quick? I just want to, I think there's
Please.
2 points, Dr. Ailawadhi, that you made that I just want to make sure we reiterate. And one of those is the quality of life and the logistical load of traveling for a trial, which is just so, it can't be understated, the importance of this. So when you're looking, even some of the bispecifics, it might be once a week, it might be once every 2 weeks, there are ones that are once every 3 weeks. And even some of the trials, it depends on the cohort. So some of the cohorts may be weekly, some may be once every 2 weeks, right? And I think that it changes the conversation when you're saying there's a limited duration of therapy, such as a CAR T or such as the CLR 131. All of a sudden, the thought of traveling down to Mayo Jacksonville from Rochester or from the middle of the country may be a little bit more tenable, or you might be able to do that, right? So I think understanding what the expectations of the trial, what that looks like, and what the treatment requirements are is just so critically important. It is number one. And the second thing is, it's always helpful to ask. We know that non-secretory is a hard exclusion for a lot of trials. It is a hurdle to get over, but not all of them, right? And even as Dr. Ailawadhi is saying here, it's not a given, right? But we love it when sponsors are willing to at least look and take physician input from the patient, from the physician, and say, is this a safe and prudent choice for us to go on as a non-secretory patient? Because what else are we left with? Even some of the expanded access programs don't allow for non-secretory patients, which to me is mind-boggling in many ways. We have no other options, but you're non-secretory, so we can't give you this. That's another conversation, and we can get into that. But I think be an advocate, ask those questions, have your doctor talk to the pharma company. Some are willing to bend, others aren't, but we'll never, squeaky wheel gets the grease essentially. And I just want to make sure that those 2 points are sort of reiterated. So thank you.
Yeah, and can I make a point too?
Please.
So Dr. Alawati does a lot of disparities work and really did a lot of work trying to understand at his clinic why someone would join a clinical trial. He put together his own questionnaire, but then he shared that questionnaire with us. We put it into our HealthTree Cure Hub platform, and then we socialized it with all the myeloma patients in that platform to better understand what are the issues of joining clinical trials. Is it travel? Is it dosing? Is it frequency? Is it side effect profiles? What we need to understand, what are the issues for clinical trial development? You think about all the new clinical trials that want to be more distributed, or those opportunities that could exist with better technology, and really open up the platforms of these clinical trials to different people who may not be able to do all this travel, or have barriers for certain things. So I just want to applaud his efforts in trying to understand the core issues, and it was a privilege to be able to help him find the answers to those using the HealthTree Cure Hub database.
Thank you, Jenny.
Can I make one more comment?
Yes, please.
To build on a lot of different points that were made. Multiple myeloma, as everyone on this webinar knows, and hopefully people watching, it does predominantly affect a number of traditionally underserved patients who, for a number of reasons, can't travel, whether it's financial, whether it's physical, there's many different reasons. And, we are also committed to making sure that we're taking away some of those barriers for patients as well. And some of those have been talked about already. Financial, one commitment that we're making in our latest strategic plan is to make sure that that financial barriers are not a reason for participating in clinical trials. And even, some of the bispecifics or CAR-T where patients are hospitalized, forget about the traditional childcare transportation. But if, someone's an hourly worker, that becomes a lot more difficult for the trial, but even when these treatments are FDA approved. And another piece related to the non-secretory is eligibility criteria. And the eligibility criteria for multiple myeloma tends to exclude a lot of the patients who probably could benefit most from the clinical trials, those that have significant comorbidities. And then even in terms of standard lab values, they don't necessarily apply to all of the patient populations. So this is another area where we as an organization want to work with the entire community to say, can we look at the eligibility criteria for trials? We'll be convening something in the fall. Would love every single person on this line to be part of that, and then get buy-in from the community and hopefully take that forward so that trials can be much more inclusive. It drives me crazy when I see 5% of cancer patients participate. Well, part of that is they're just not eligible. It's not that they don't want to, or there are the barriers that Jenny mentioned, but straight up, they're just not eligible to be part of the trials, even if they could get there and there were no financial barriers. So these are things that we feel very strongly about. And again, it's going to take the entire community working together. It's no one single, entity is going to solve this.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Priya, if you don't mind, Dr. Alawati, I'm curious. So that was a great question, Anne. And is there twofold? One, Jenny, your internet was breaking up a little bit, so I don't know if you shared this, but what was the big takeaway from the survey? What was some of the biggest things that you learned? One, and two, to Anne's point, what are the biggest exclusion criteria that we're seeing, especially from a minority patient population? Is it measurable disease? Is it kidney? Like, what other lab values are excluding on that side? Can you briefly touch on that?
Sure. Brian, thanks a lot for that question, because I'd raised my hand because I wanted to touch upon a few things, but I didn't want to I wanted to make sure that Priya has time to ask all the things that she's wanting to. So I'll quickly touch upon a few things. So yes, excellent collaboration with HealthTree, which, by the way, in my mind, this is a way to do real world research rather than just looking at databases where things are missing. HealthTree gave us, for example, a platform to be able to run that survey among specifically myeloma patients. I'll be forthcoming and say that That particular analysis out of the myeloma patients from HealthTree, we have not been able to complete that analysis yet, because you can imagine doing the statistical analysis on this survey, which is a 55-question survey, breaking it into 5 different domains, and then running an analysis and doing it according to patient criteria, age, demographics, etc. It's quite complicated. So I've not been able to finalize that analysis, but I'll share with you that we did analyze the first 250 patients at Mayo Clinic. This was a lot of different kinds of cancers, not specifically myeloma. Myeloma was a big part of it. And the survey is focused, and we created this survey with our Mayo Clinic Survey Research Center. So validated questions, keeping in mind what surveys, how the language should be, it's non-leading, et cetera, et cetera. And we had, the survey is focused on 5 different domains. It does talk about bias and fear of research and fear of pharma, awareness, et cetera, et cetera. And the commitment to this study was that initially we said we're gonna enroll 500 patients. We said that at least 100 will be African Americans and at least 100 will be Hispanics, because we don't want the minorities and underserved to be kind of diluted out in the final analysis. So the first analysis we ran was about 250 patients when we had hit the half mark. And in those, 45 were African Americans, 45 were Hispanics, and the rest were white. And what we found was that African Americans had a statistically significant lower awareness of clinical trials. That was the one thing that came out different in our initial analysis. That portion, the 500 patient analysis is being done. But to qualify that, think of it this way. These are all patients who are coming to Mayo Clinic. They are already meeting a certain criteria that they have come to Mayo, where about 60 to 70% of our patients may be coming from distances. So they have some means, they have sought us out, they're coming to a large cancer center. These were all patients who were new to Mayo. We didn't want to bias by the information we give to patients. So these are those who are new to Mayo. And still, African Americans had a significantly lower awareness of trials. So that is just setting the stage, but we're running those analyses and we're hoping that at least some updated analysis can be brought out of that. And the second part of the question, which Anne, you raised, and I didn't touch upon it earlier, but Priya, it's important for the whole of our listener pool to be able to realize and estimate. So I do a lot of work with health disparities, and within that, clinical trials is a big focus of my work. But it's important for everybody to realize, just like Anne said, a lot of times patients who are traditionally underrepresented in trials, the trials are actually set up in a way, the inclusion criteria is set up in a way against them, just like what Anne mentioned. So we published the paper now in, I believe, 2014, and then an update that was like 2018-ish, I think, where African Americans are more likely to have more anemia, more kidney dysfunction, more need for dialysis, and more hypercalcemia, kind of the traditional myeloma defining event at the time of diagnosis. The one thing that African Americans have lesser is fractures because of genetically stronger, higher bone density. So with that whole background, we also know that African Americans tend to have lower neutrophil levels as a race, nothing to do with myeloma, as a race, lower neutrophil levels, so easier to exclude out of trials. So with that backdrop, and I'm glad, Anne, that MMRF is looking into it, and I'd be glad to participate and help in any way. So we have a forthcoming newly diagnosed randomized phase 3 cooperative group clinical trial coming out of SWOG, and I'm the chair for that, and I have a couple of very good co-chairs who we are writing that protocol. And the idea is this is going to be about a 500 patient clinical trial supported by NCI, but we are challenging this paradigm. We will allow patients with a hemoglobin not 8, but 7 would be the limit. We will allow patients to go on not with an ANC or absolute neutrophil count of 1, but 0.75. We will allow actually transfusions and growth factors to get onto the trial, because the bottom line is, well, if you have enough disease that you need to be treated, it doesn't make sense that the disease is the problem and you don't want the patient on. And 2 nights ago, I think I was on a forum, which was a pharmaceutical company run forum. And I made a huge plea to that particular company. I said, guys, I know this is putting your drug in an unsafe zone to be giving your drug to patients who have poor kidney function, poor counts, etc. But please, wherever you feel there is a possibility, make that push. So for example, in that try, currently as it's written, every patient will go on irrespective of kidney function, even dialysis patients. But there is a lot of discussion going back and forth where the sponsor or the supporter, sponsor is NCI, but the supporter of the study is saying that, well, we just feel a little uncomfortable because the safety in dialysis patients has not been defined. And I get that. But short of dialysis, most likely every kidney function will be allowed to go on. And we're making an attempt. And frankly, we will track if this helps bring in more minorities. So hopefully it'll come full circle, but I'm glad that we are talking about all of this.
And
back to you.
Is a protocol IRB approved already? And is it moving forward with that criteria?
And not yet IRB approved, but NCI has reviewed it, and NCI has actually given a green light to move forward with that concept with those inclusion criteria. The myeloma steering committee, I would say kudos to the myeloma community, where the myeloma steering committee at NCI has actually reviewed those and has given us a go ahead to do that. So the protocol is currently being developed, and we're hoping that by Q3 of this year, and that is also, I should add, is specifically for patients who are frail, intermediate fit, elderly, and the goal is, well, these are the patients who we don't study, but these are the patients we see in clinic. So it'll be a trial newly diagnosed for frail and intermediate fit, elderly patients, traditionally transplant ineligible patients, and it will allow a lot of kidney dysfunction. It will allow a lot of lower counts, because bottom line is, trial or no trial, I'm the doctor, that's my patient. I have to treat them. Is it possible for me to treat them on trial? So trying to make more real world studies.
And I think it'll just take one. I mean, again, it's going to take the community, but once there's one trial,
you got to start somewhere.
Sponsor, we can influence the rest. There aren't too many, I'd say, hard and fast mandates or regulations. Even FDA doesn't mandate that the trials look like the population of the disease. That there's certain groups that are represented, but the more I think we as a community can unite and really push for these types of things, I do think change is possible.
Thank you. I think that was quite a good discussion on trials and equity. And I know MMRF is doing a lot on this. Also, why don't you just educate our listeners on, the multi-pronged approach that MMRF has towards to advance precision medicine. Touch upon CureCloud, MyDRUG, Commpass.
Sure, absolutely. So it's long been known for many, many years, even when we didn't have the technology we have today, that myeloma is a heterogeneous disease. It's not characterized by a single mutation like some other cancers are. So that means, and being uncommon, it's not like there's enough patients at any one center to really understand the diversity of the disease and how best to treat those different patients. So we've had a commitment, I think we launched our tissue bank back in 2004 to creating a central resource of a critical mass of patients and data to help the entire research community start to make sense of multiple myeloma. Our biggest effort to date is the Compass study that launched in 2011, where we enrolled 1,100 newly diagnosed, untreated patients. It took 76 different sites in 4 different countries, but we followed those patients, collecting their clinical data, doing DNA and RNA sequencing on 3 different platforms for at least 8 years. So enrollment took 4 years. We still have about half those patients enrolled in the study and continue to collect that data. It's taught us some really important findings. We've identified new targets. We've taken them into the MyDRUG trial that I'll mention next. It's also helped us better understand risk. The whole concept of double hit, missing both copies of P53 versus just one, which was only FISH couldn't really differentiate between the two. Now with genomic sequencing, we can and really understand who's at higher risk, or the importance of a 1Q amplification, which has been replicated in other studies as well. But just how important that is as a risk factor. Compass has been really helpful in, again, helping the community understand that. And then we did take findings from Compass, and we created a platform trial called MyDRUG. So there's 6 different arms, and patients are assigned to an arm based on their specific genomic alteration. About 50% of the patients don't have a genomic alteration and have been put in there's now 3 different arms that they're put in. But what's been exciting so far is we've seen in one of the arms, we've seen some clinical benefit. And last year at EHA presented information on cobimetinib, and we've expanded that cohort. There's a poster at ASCO, and we'll continue to follow those patients. Again, what this has meant is opening up treatment options for patients who may have run out of treatment options. All the treatments in MyDRUG are FDA-approved oral treatments for other cancers, so they're commercially available. And then our other effort in this space is CureCloud, a newer effort, and it's also a longitudinal clinical genomic study like Compass, but it's different in that we can enroll patients anywhere. You don't need to be seen at a specific center. It's still an IRB-approved research protocol designed to answer the question of what patients should receive what treatments and what combinations and what sequence. But again, you can enroll online. Patients sign a waiver so that they contribute key fields from their electronic medical record. They don't need to complete a lengthy case report form. And then in an attempt to, can we move beyond at some point bone marrow biopsies, we have a liquid biopsy, which means we take a blood sample and then sequence that on a panel of 70 genes that are commonly seen in multiple myeloma. How this is different is we don't have the deep sequencing information, but we have a wealth of clinical information. We have clinical information going all the way back to when patients were diagnosed. So even though patients are enrolling at different points in their journey, we have longitudinal pictures now of more than 800 patients. And similar to Compass, we are committed to making that data publicly available to researchers as well, again, to continue the field and generate hypotheses that could drive precision medicine. One point to tie a couple of things together too. So there's clinical trials, which we are very important, but there's also the observational research that I mentioned as well, which is Compass, which is CureCloud. Yeah. And what we're doing now with CureCloud is we made it direct to patient. It'll always be direct to patient, but now we're adding a hybrid model where we're going through sites. And what happened, why we're doing that, is we're working with sites that we've worked with in Compass and CureCloud who have a successful track record in enrolling a diverse set of patients, the patients that look like the real world face of myeloma. But what we're finding is in this direct to patient model, they're not necessarily enrolling in the trial. So then we had to go back to what the barriers are. And it's simple as, the doctor tells a patient, and this is, in particular, we're trying to make sure that we have enough Black patients enrolled as well about the trial. They're excited, and then nothing happens. So to take away the burden on the patient to remember to go home, to log on, to sign the consent. Or for some patients, it may be as simple, they don't have access to steady Wi-Fi. So we're working with the sites and we'll be arming them with the technology to make it possible. And funny enough, as a direct-to-patient initiative, some sites want the paper consent. So it's a funny thing where you combine technology and making this available to everyone to going back to methods to say not everyone has access to technology or are comfortable with it. So how do we make this as easy as possible for patients? Because again, trials are one thing, but if we're not enrolling a diverse set of patients in these observational studies, we're never going to understand, where you have differences in outcomes, what's biology, what's access, because you need that representation from all different parties in the studies. And there's still friction or hesitation or lack of knowledge about enrolling in the study, even those kinds of studies, forget about interventional clinical trials.
Thank you, Anne.
And
Just want to be mindful of everybody's time. One last question before we wrap up. What next for myeloma? Dr. Elavati, you can start with you. What do you think?
So Priya, just to summarize, I think what's next, I feel because of all of this effort that is being done by patients, advocacy, pharma, regulatory institutions, clinicians, I think what's next is I'm hopeful that we will see a larger, broader access to clinical trials and novel treatments for everybody, including our traditionally underserved patients. I'm very hopeful that will happen. And I think what's next is what will happen is newer classes of drugs will come by. But I'm hopeful, or what I want happens is that we get a slightly better understanding of how to sequence the right drug for the right patient at the right time. And that's where I think efforts like those from MMRF and Health Free and Spark Cures will also help us figure out, I'm a clinician, I have a patient, which drug, which regimen is the right for my patient to use at this point. So that kind of a precision medicine focus is where I want the field to go. But what's next is lots of different promising options that will become available and broader clinical trial enrollment, which I'm sure will happen with time soon.
Thank you, Dr. Anne. I love the Anne. Your turn next. So how is MMRF continuing to accelerate?
I think Dr. Alwadi said it best. I mean, I said at the beginning, we talked about this at the beginning, there's unprecedented hope and optimism and potential transformation in the field right now. It would be a complete travesty if only certain patients benefited from those breakthroughs. So it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that, again, all patients have access to the trials and ultimately to the treatment. And then the data from all of us is made available. And how do we better collaborate to answer those questions of precision medicine, where based on all different characteristics of a patient, we can tell a patient and their doctor, okay, here's the right combination in this order based on your genomics, immune profile, et cetera. That's the future. And that's how we're going to get to cures.
Thank you. And Jenny, I know Health Free is doing a lot in terms of educating the community. What is next for you as an advocate?
Well, it goes along with what has just been said. We think things need to go faster. Mm-hmm. Research needs to be simultaneously faster. And that's why we built the Health Tree Cure Hub platform. So we now have over 10,000 patients who are participating in that portal. And what we can do is we've worked with about 15 investigators far on specific research questions, but we'll be opening the platform up to allow researchers like Dr. Alawadi to answer these research questions simultaneously using real world evidence. And, we've asked some of these investigators, we just ran a survey, even what does cure mean to my myeloma patient? And we were able to get 1,500 responses in less than 4 weeks. And I asked the investigator, how long would that have taken you? Oh, a year to a year and a half, and probably at least $100,000 to hire a research coordinator. Why? Like, it doesn't make any sense to have the expense and the time to answer simple questions like that. It's just kind of ridiculous that we can run IRB approved studies simultaneously in the platform and come to conclusions just a lot faster. That's where I think things need to head.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny. Brian, any last message? Any message for
all that stuff was great. Yeah, I agree. Faster, I think, and unprecedented hope and optimism. I think it's a great way to phrase that. I think that we need to raise awareness. I think if you're a patient, make sure you're seeing a specialist. I think the idea of these novel therapies going early and earlier into the lines of therapy. In fact, we're seeing trials with bispecifics and smoldering that are going to be coming up here. I mean, this is a really exciting, all due respect, time in terms of what we're seeing from a data standpoint and when patients are going to be able to access this in their journey with myeloma. So I think all of that is really amazing. So, consider joining a research study, whether it's observational, that it's just as helpful as therapeutic or treatment-based trials. Just help provide insights into this. It's the only way we're going to move forward with this and find that cure, whether, however it's defined. That's how it's going to happen. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. What I find the most exciting is, patients stepping up and partnering with the investigators, researchers towards this particular goal of finding more treatments, finding a cure. So on that note, thanks everybody. Thanks for everything that all of you are doing. And thank you, Dr. Ailavati and Jenny and Brian for joining me today on Cure Talks. This talk will be available on our website. Have a good evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.